So I thought if we could kick things off, and I'll introduce each of you to describe your roles a little bit and how you got into the work that you're doing now. And I will start with Christina, if that's all right.
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry, couldn't unmute myself. Hi, I'm Christina. I'm the development manager at the Garden Museum, like Catriona said. So the Garden Museum is the UK's only museum dedicated to the art, history and design of British gardens. So we're situated in a medieval church on the Thames. So I'm the only person working in fundraising at the museum, which is quite usual for small to medium-sized museums. I work with the director mostly. He's very involved in our fundraising, and I line manage a membership secretary who does 1 day a week looking after our memberships, posting out cards and what have you. So that means I look after all aspects of fundraising. So that's charitable donations from trusts and foundations, our relationship with bodies such as the Heritage Lottery Fund, the Art Fund, donations from individuals or high net worth individuals, as you horribly come to call them, corporate sponsors and friends and patrons. So in a normal year, that means I look after about £500,000 of income, which is about 30% of our total income of a museum. Obviously this year, wildly different, but I'm sure we'll come on to that. I'm also responsible for art sales. We generate a lot of our income with working with contemporary artists and galleries on selling shows on the themes of gardens. And I manage some of our public programs as well. So things like British Flowers Week and our young people's program, which is called the Young Fronds, which I founded a year ago. Just quickly, so I fell into fundraising. I was a graduate trainee at the British Museum in their development department, which was a full-time, year-long job in the fundraising team where I was looking after gift administration. So I managed to get that job because I had experience with databases, because I'd worked in a theatre box office throughout university. I knew I wanted to do something in the arts to do with money, and I considered a career in theatre producing. But in the end, I got this job at the British Museum straight out of university, which was great. Thank goodness, because the late nights of theatre, not for me. Museum daytime is much better. So my traineeship was super helpful. It gave me an insight into all the different facets of museum fundraising, of which, as I've just listed, there are loads. In the second biggest department of fundraising in a museum in the country, I think. I'll send the link to that job because that traineeship still exists now. Once it finished, I took a role at the British Museum in the events department, running big parties and exhibition openings for donors. And then I moved to the V&A, where I was in their learning academy. So I was running income generating courses. So things like weekend courses on like pre-Raphaelites and all that kind of stuff. Then I decided to go somewhere much smaller. I wanted somewhere that I could make a real difference, get my teeth in. And that's how I ended up at the Garden Museum 4 years ago during its redevelopment project. And I've been there ever since. Sorry, I hope that wasn't really long.
That was fascinating. Thank you very much. What an amazing route in. And oh my goodness, how much do you do? I'm sure that will be a theme of the day. So we'll move on to Georgia, please, if that's all right.
Hi everyone, so I'm Georgia. I currently work at Amnesty International, but before that I was at the Natural History Museum. My route into fundraising is kind of similarly squiggly, I would say, in that before I worked in museums and culture, I actually was trained as a research scientist. So again, experience with databases, experience with kind of research and that sort of thing. And then decided to sort of follow my love of museums and galleries and did a postgrad degree and actually started out in collection care. So I trained in curating, started off there and then kind of side hopped a couple of times, once into museum education, which was amazing, working with schools, you know, designing resources packs for schools and for children who would visit with families. And then from there sort of sidestepped again into fundraising, and I started out in trusts and foundations and then moved into a little bit of corporate, kind of as you do when you're early stages and you're sort of trying a lot of things out to see what fits. And before the Natural History Museum, I worked at an arts charity in East London called the Archaeology Trust. They put on the Lumiere London when that happens. They're the charity responsible for that. So that was great fun. And then from there, I moved on to the Natural History Museum and what I specialize in is major donor fundraising. So that is the sort of the big one-off gifts from individuals rather than from trusts and foundations or from corporate partnerships.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So yes, another huge role, long list of things. Zoe, please would you go next? Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Zoe, and just hearing Christina and Georgia talk, I've realised that we've got the whole of Exhibition Road represented at this point. So I'm Zoe, I'm the Senior Development Manager for Trust Foundations and Government, one of the longest titles I've ever held, at the Science Museum Group. So predominantly I work in London at the Science Museum, but we also have sites. We have the National Railway Museum in York, the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester, and the National Science and Media Museum up in Bradford, and a couple of satellite sites as well that I tend to get involved with. What I do on a kind of daily basis, I focus on trusts and foundations, which is seeking the money from small family foundations right up to National Lottery Heritage Fund and kind of government grants as well. I, like everyone else, kind of fell into fundraising. I think that is the common thread, and kind of like what this whole summit is addressing. I kind of got into fundraising via an internship. Luckily enough for me, it was a paid internship from that my university ran. So I went to the University of Birmingham. They ran a cultural placement scheme. It was fabulous, and I ended up working with a small dance charity over in Birmingham doing some of their fundraising. Kind of the opposite to Christina, I really enjoyed that whole process, learning about how to kind of reach out to trusts, learning how to make that ask, make that connection. But I really wanted to do it in quite a big organization. So in massive contrast, I think we probably have about 36 people in our development team in London alone, and about 4 of us in the trust team, so working across kind of 5 sites, which feels a bit less big now I've said it. And we kind of focus mainly on our big capital projects, our big builds and new galleries, things like that. But there's always room to get involved with other bits and pieces as well.
Thank you very much, everybody. Just in listening to you, I wonder, it might just be how things have worked out today, but are many museum fundraising roles focused in London? Do they tend to be the big London museums that have museum fundraising roles? Is that something that might be worth considering if you're hoping to go into this area? Please, Georgia.
Yeah, so I would say there are a lot in London, I think, because a lot of the places that can afford to recruit for more than one person to do fundraising are based in London. Unfortunately, that is sort of how it is at the moment. We sort of wish it was different and there was more resource for more fundraisers in more spread out locations. But certainly places like Birmingham Museums Trust, these sort of places, especially in the big cities, there are more, I would say. So it's not exclusively London, but unfortunately there is a lot. It's pretty heavily London based, and that is less to do with there being more need in London and more to do with there being more resources in London, I'm afraid.
Yeah,
thank you, Christina.
Oh, sorry.
I think Christina had just unmuted just beforehand. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. I was just going to add, I totally agree with what Georgia said. And also, I think the further out of London you go, it's more common to see fundraising roles combined with other roles. So often your museum director will be your kind of key fundraiser or your curator. And that's why I think it's really important that everyone kind of have the basic fundraising skills, just regardless of their role in a museum. More and more, it's so important that we all kind of know how to make that dollar. Yeah, that's what I would add. Sorry to interrupt.
Don't worry, Zoe, please.
No, I was just yeah, like Christina and Georgia have already said, it isn't that there's more need in London. I think it's more that there are more nationals in London which have the capacity to recruit for fundraisers and have that resource available. And like Christina said, the further out you go, that the roles tend to combine. But I think I was actually talking about this the other day, and kind of by the very nature of you working in a museum or working in the arts and cultural sector, you kind of have to be a fundraiser. So it just might be that there are fewer elements of that fundraising role in a role further outside of London, but I think that's something that you can always kind of beef up and focus on.
Thank you. And again, to go slightly off piece, because I think probably people will be wondering this now, is there anything you would recommend for people to develop those skills if their role isn't solely focused on fundraising? And I'm definitely somebody who's had to do a little bit of fundraising in every role that I've ever been in, particularly my first one where I was the sole curator. So yeah, do you have any tips or advice about resources or training or anything that you'd recommend people follow up?
So I'll give a small plug actually, but I think firstly, the Institute of Fundraising has some great resources. It has some good courses as well. Sometimes the courses can, and I don't mean this in a mean way, sometimes the courses can feel quite basic, but they are really, really useful. And also what the Institute of Fundraising has attached to it, or kind of alongside that, there are quite a lot of special interest groups that you can get involved with. So there's a trust group, there's a corporate group. And then there are organizations like Young Arts Fundraisers, which I'm on the board of, which we just run events and we run mentoring schemes for early career fundraisers in the arts and people looking to get into the arts and looking to get into fundraising. So I think there are courses that you can do and there are resources that you can look at, but one of the best things you can do is attend events that talk about it and cover the questions that fundraisers are asking and want the answers to. And I think kind of getting into those networks is really key.
Thank you, Georgia.
Yeah, I would completely agree with Zoe on that. I think the other thing about Institute of Fundraising and a lot of these events is often there are bursaries or the option to pay less if you come from a smaller organization or if you're funding your own training. So those are really worth looking into if you are from a smaller organization and you have a sort of multifaceted role, let's say, in the way of split roles, which often end up being three halves of a job. The other thing I wanted to add is just reaching out to fundraisers in other organizations and asking for their advice. I don't know a single fundraiser who would ever turn down chatting to somebody about some skills and tips to help. And certainly I've done that in the past and continue to do it, you know, with people who maybe they're working for a smaller organization, their experience is mostly with trusts or is mostly with membership kind of fundraising, and they're looking to do something a bit different. I would say reach out, and it's one of the benefits of attending these sort of events is meeting people, meeting other fundraisers and learning off them as well.
Thank you very much. I've just seen, oh no, you've replied, Zoe. I was going to ask, but you've already replied. There we go. Very, very hot on that. Thank you. So the first proper question I had pre-prepared was, what is the biggest misconception about your role? Christina.
I was having a think about this, and I think the main misconception is that we just get the money and then we hand it over and that's it, that's our job done. I think there's this huge misconception that fundraisers, we sit in a separate office, which in my experience is usually a lovely office. Like when I used to work at the British Museum, oh my goodness, we lived in like the palatial, like old director's quarters. It was so nice. And then when I moved to events, it was like the grotty basement. Anyway, I think that people think we sit in the smart office and we have lunch with millionaires every day and we never step foot on the museum floor. And it's just not true at all. So when you set out to fund a project, and like up front, you could argue museum fundraising is a little bit broken in that it is very project specific. So I'm sure we'll talk about this later. But when you go out to fund a project, as a fundraiser, you so often help to shape them, which is such a joy. It's one of the best bits of the job. So I've worked so closely with our learning department, our curatorial team, our archive, exhibitions, the garden team. You help make a project into being because you as the fundraiser know what sells, if you will, like what will generate that income, and it's great. I think that's the biggest misconception.
Thank you. Thanks. Zoe or Georgia, would you like to jump in? Georgia.
Yeah, sure, I'll jump in. I think completely agree with Christina, this misconception that, you know, all we do is kind of schmooze and go to fancy dinners and then the money just kind of comes rolling in is one of my biggest pet peeves that people think about fundraising as a job. And the other one that I really thought about was time and kind of how long it can take. I don't know how many times, I've had people come to me, when I was at the museum, or even now when, now that I'm at Amnesty, where people will come to me with these amazing projects and they're so fundable, they're so appealing. And then they say, we really need it by kind of a couple of weeks' time. And you're like, well, I don't think that's going to happen, because it can take, and I'm, specifically talking about major donor fundraising here. So I know Zoe and Christina will probably be able to speak more to the other kinds. But for major donor fundraising, from the time you meet a donor for the first time to getting a gift in, the average time it takes is about a year. And, it can be more, can be less, depending on the donor, the project, how well aligned they are, all these sorts of things. But yeah, like the number of people who just don't realize how long it takes to get a gift in. That's the other big one that I thought of, really.
Thank you. I think that's really useful for anybody listening, especially me. Thank you. Not that I would ever assume a fortnight was okay. I'll just say that now. Sorry, please.
Oh, no, just to again, completely agree with Christina and Georgia, that big misconception about you going to a dinner and having a glass of wine with someone and them writing a check immediately is one. And I think something Christina kind of touched on, and Georgia as well, that time element. And for trusts, I would say that that's a deadline for an application is in a week's time, and people come to you and go, well, it's in a week's time. That's enough time, right? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. You don't even have a budget yet. Come on. And I think that that what Christina was talking about, the kind of when you do get in on the ground floor, so to speak, with those projects, I think the other misconception is that you completely go away once the money's secured. But there is, you do need to know what's going on, where the money is being spent, how it's being spent, how the project is going. And I mean, I think that's one of the best parts about the job, is being able to see a project through from start to finish. But I think there is a bit of a misconception that you kind of float in, chuck money at somebody and then float away again, which isn't true.
I just had a really lovely mental image of all of you with like money bags under your arms, just handing it out, Robin Hood style. That's quite pleasing. So that's not the case for anyone listening. That's not how it works, obviously. There's quite a nice question here from somebody saying, to what extent do the panel think it's possible to move in and out of formal fundraising roles? She'd like to know if the panel would consider moving back into events or curatorial or other areas. Is that something you've considered, Georgia?
Yeah, it's definitely something I've considered, and especially when I first got into fundraising, and I just made the transition over from working in museum education and previously in collections. Whenever I've worked with a curator or on an exhibition, I've always, I think every project makes me want to go and work in that area, to be totally honest. Especially because that's how I got into this in the first place. So I think there are definitely some exhibitions that I've worked on and some projects that I've worked on that have made me go, oh, great to work on this sort of thing full time, such an interesting project, I'd love to do this. But, so I do think about it from time to time, and I do think it's the case that actually the longer you're in a specific career, the harder it is to make these sort of transitions, and you have to be willing to sort of take a bit of a hit in pay or take a back step into a more junior role. And if that's something that is okay with you, then absolutely go for it if it's what you want. But I think for me, I feel like I found my niche with fundraising, and I really enjoy it. And part of the joy of it for me is working on lots of different projects and working with lots of different people and learning about kind of everything that your organization does. You get to kind of go and meet the most interesting people because they all work on these amazing projects and these amazing exhibitions. And I don't know that I would get that variety if I went back into a more specific kind of curation or into education.
Thank you. Oh, Christina, yeah.
I was just going to add, as we were saying before, there's something about fundraising in smaller organisations that is just a bit more across many avenues. So, I mean, everyone else on the panel will do a lot more, I don't know how to explain it. I feel like, because I do so many different styles of fundraising, a lot of it is very surface level, as opposed to other members of the panel who will go into much, you know, trust and foundations isn't my whole job, but it does mean that I get to work more across, like I said, public programs and exhibitions and all these other areas. So if you did want something with a bit more variety, I would really recommend that people look into kind of small, mid-sized museum fundraising, just because it's a bit more yeah, it's a bit more varied, and like George said, fundraising is just a very varied role to work in. So if that's what you enjoy, I definitely recommend it.
Thanks, Zoe.
Yeah, and just to kind of back that up and reiterate, like what we were saying, you know, you do really get involved in these projects. So actually, you do get that element of curation or project management or marketing or digital comms, like, you know, it is so varied, and you can kind of, because it is part of your job to know what's going on in a project, for example, you can get as involved as you'd like, certainly in my experience. And so yeah, it is that variance, it is that breadth of experience that you get from working in fundraising, that I haven't really, now I'm in it, I haven't really considered leaving it. But I think conversely, actually, if you do find something whilst you're working in fundraising that you think you'd be amazing at and that you absolutely love, fundraising has given you that opportunity to sort of find it, and it will give you those transferable skills as well.
Which is a great segue into the next question I was going to ask, so thank you very much, which is, what do you think are the most useful skills to have in fundraising? Christina.
So it sounds like a cliche, I'm so sorry, but communication, I know that sounds like such a textbook answer, but fundraising is all about speaking to people and writing, in my experience. So I really wasn't much of a fundraiser before I learned the art of small talk, and remembering faces and names is so important. And it's like we were saying before, there is a lot of schmoozing, and that used to really scare me. I remember before I started fundraising, I used to see fundraisers who had kind of a different background to me, and I felt really self-conscious about it. I think there is a kind of very typical fundraiser. But one day I just decided, you know, you just have to plunge in, and it is all about this, like, being comfortable with your donors and being able to talk about how much you love arts and heritage. Like that is ultimately what it comes down to, which is why I love my job. I always joke that the museum literally paid me to be nice to people, and it's true. But the other one is writing. So if you weren't someone who liked writing essays at school, I really don't think fundraising is for you, because on any given day, I'm either writing a funding application or I'm writing a report evaluating a successful application, which is good for me. I love writing and I'm really quick at it. But if you struggle and you weren't a natural writer, maybe Georgia and Zoe might disagree, but I would say it's like quite a key part of the job. But yeah, I'd say above all, the skills you need are being able to talk about how much you love your museum, why it needs money, why a project is worthy of someone's time. And if you like doing that all day, do fundraising, it's great.
Thank you. Zoe, thank you.
I would completely agree, and I certainly for trust fundraising, writing is absolutely key. And writing concisely, I think there can be that sort of misnomer that you have to write reams and reams of material, and actually sometimes people just want 2 sides of A4, and it's quite difficult to get an entire 3-year gallery project into that. I think that what I would say is key is resilience, because I think something we maybe haven't touched upon is that you do get no's. Not everything you do is successful, which is absolutely fine, and there's always something that you can learn from getting a no to an application or getting a no to an ask. But it's being able to be resilient enough to sort of pick yourself up again, go again, find a different fund to apply to, or in some cases, you know, maybe sitting down with that team that you know helped you with the information for the application and going, actually, this isn't going to work. This has come back with a no, and I am being resilient enough to sit down with you and tell you that we need to change this, or it's not going to go ahead. And just being able to kind of pick yourself up, I think, is really important.
Thank you. Yes, thanks, Georgia.
Yeah, I would completely agree with the resilience point. I think being able to kind of hear the no and not have it kind of hit you quite so hard, and to sort of be able to pick yourself back up and not give up on the project, and not give up on the donor either as well. You know, this might just not be the right project for them, or it might not be, you know, quite what they're looking for. You know, there's all sorts of things that can come into it, and not taking it personally has been a really hard lesson that I've learned through being in fundraising. I was fairly resilient when I came into fundraising, but I definitely am way above where I started from just being in it and from learning those skills. And I think it is a role that teaches you resilience as well. You come in with some resilience, it helps a lot, but it will teach you it as well, I think, you know, just from the kind of job it is, you know. And it can be really hard to hear a no when you've worked so hard on an application, or if you've kind of spent months building up a relationship with a donor and you think this is the perfect project for them, and then they just say no. And you have to sort of go, oh, well, you know, it is what it is, pick yourself back up and try with a different donor or try with a different approach and that sort of thing. I think the other thing I would say in terms of really useful skills is enthusiasm and creativity. Like has been touched on before, I think enthusiasm for your cause and enthusiasm and belief in the place you work for is something you really can't fake. And it is one of the most useful skills and parts of being a fundraiser, is being able to talk with joy about what you do and to be able to sell it authentically. You know, if you don't come across as someone who really believes in the work, then why should anybody else believe in it and give you money for it? So I would say that that's one of the key things. And it's why I think it's why you tend to see fundraisers, even if they move around a little bit, they sort of stay within certain areas, because you tend to see people working for causes as fundraisers that they really believe in, because that's how you're successful as a fundraiser, is you work for places that resonate with you. And often if they resonate with you and they resonate with the donor, then that's a way of building a relationship as well. You're already sort of starting on the same page. And the creativity element, I think, it is just key. You know, I love fundraising because it is that combination of strategy and creativity. And I think the creativity to be able to kind of look at a project and pull out the different bits that make it appealing, that make it appealing to a specific kind of donor or a specific kind of trust, and being able to pull those elements together and create a proposal and that sort of thing, I think is really, really key. And I think all of the things we've touched on can be taught. You can learn them on the job, but if you come in with a bit of them to start with, it's a huge help.
Thank you very much. Actually, that's helpful as well. I wonder if Christina and Zoe, if you have any comments about how, if you see fundraising as a creative process as well, is that something that you would agree with or relate to? Christina?
Yeah, as I was saying before, so a lot of fundraising is about working in this kind of ecosystem of philanthropy. So it's a lot of someone giving a gift and then you maintaining a relationship with them, or even, you know, before they've given a gift. It's not all about that. It's not all about the parties, but a lot of it is. So as a fundraiser, I do manage a lot of events. And like I say, that was kind of one of my routes into my role now. So whether it's, you know, whether we're organising a Christmas party for the friends who give £40 a year, or we're doing an exhibition opening for our major donors, or when I was at the British Museum, I'd organise breakfast for media partners, like Arts Council or whatever. There is a lot of creativity in that sense. But I also look after corporate fundraising, and I'd say that more than any other area in my job, that's where the innovation is really big at the moment. So kind of the days of having a logo on a poster are kind of ever so slightly disappearing, and I feel like it's now more about identifying more of a meaningful relationship with a corporate partner, and that requires a hell of a lot of innovation at the moment, kind of rethinking how we see a corporate museum relationship. So there's some super exciting examples at the moment. Things like the National Portrait Gallery just did a big project with Disney Plus. That was super exciting. Natural History Museum have a partnership with Airbnb, which you should look both of those up. They're really like new takes on that relationship. And yeah, I'd say corporate above all is where I'm having to think most outside of the box. And corporate fundraising is a whole job for loads of people. So if that's something that you wanted to work in, I feel like I don't meet enough museum professionals who get excited about corporate sponsorship, but that you must be out there, and I'd highly recommend it as a career, because it's a load of fun.
Thank you, Zoe, please.
That's really interesting, actually. I will take that back to my corporate partnerships team, because I think they need to hear that. I would also say, though, I think there's that same kind of revolution happening with some trusts and foundations, more the family ones, and the ones that act a little bit like a major donor in some respects, because there is still, Heritage Lottery Fund and Arts Council. They are still quite application based, and that's not going to change because they use sort of public money. So I think that's always going to be the same. But with some of the other trusts and foundations that have a little bit more leeway, I think we are also seeing that where you can be creative in talking to them about a project and bringing them along the journey with you, and not just going to them with, here is a project that you should like. Actually talking to them about it. What do you like? What difference in the world are you trying to make, and how can we help you achieve that? So I think in that sense, there's a lot of creativity in some proposals and in some forms of fundraising at the moment, like Christina was saying.
Thank you very much. We had a question from Marley in the chat a bit earlier on, asking if you had any tips on writing funding applications or bids. I wonder if anyone would like to give any tips. Probably a long answer to that question.
I'll have a crack at a few sort of small ones, because yes, this is essentially what I do for a living. I think in terms of, I think it's always good to put yourself in the position of somebody reading that application. I know that sounds really straightforward, but if you can't explain if you don't have an elevator pitch for what it is that you want funding, then your application is going to kind of it's going to be long-winded, they're not going to get through it, and it will have less of a chance. So I think approaching it in a very similar way to how you might have approached an essay at university or at school, and looking for keywords in a question and that might be, it's not a question, it's their charitable aims and purposes, or the fund criteria at that time. Looking for those keywords, trying to repeat them in any kind of application, and also making sure that you have a really punchy first couple of sentences to a paragraph, which immediately sets out your stall of what it is you want to do, why it is you should be doing it now, why you're the best people for it, and what the impact will be. I think being able to cover that in a short manner, that will get you really, really far, and then get someone else to read it afterwards. That's what I always do.
Yeah, definitely. I would definitely relate to that. The second pair of eyes, definitely a useful tip. Thank you, Christina.
I think as museum professionals, we are so ready to kind of belittle the work we do, and we're not great. Traditionally, I'd say museum people aren't natural salespeople, perhaps, and I myself am very guilty of that. I'd say the main thing I'm always telling curators or archivists who I work with on applications is you need to show a real need, and I always like to put in an application, what will happen if we don't get this money? So that's particularly true at the moment with COVID. So fundraising for the last 8 months has basically been, if you don't give us the money, XYZ will happen, and it'll be absolutely catastrophic. And I just feel in a sector where we always have to sing for our supper, we shouldn't be ashamed of angling an application like that. I mean, maybe it's a little bit aggressive, but the way fundraising works in the UK is we are all kind of competing against each other in this kind of horrible way. And you just have to, unfortunately, play the game at the moment. And that means saying, we need it, please help us.
Yeah, and also just to throw in from the charity that I'm trustee for, with the Cultural Recovery Fund, we had to tread this really weird line between we'll definitely be fine, so it's worth funding us, but we'll definitely close if you don't. And it was our fund, we had a fundraiser brought in to help us with that and our finance, and I have no idea how they trod that line successfully, but they did. It was an absolute, like, yeah, it was an incredible skill, so very difficult. So I will probably now move on to high net worth individuals, actually, rather than carry on with funding applications. And I wondered if you would be able to say a few words about how you make the ask and if you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think as British people, we find it very difficult to talk about money as a kind of cultural, not everybody, but I know I do. So I wondered if you had any advice about that and how you approach it. Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, it's always awkward. I'm not going to lie. It's, you know, on some level, when you get to the point where you actually ask the question of, you know, would you like to give us some money? It never feels entirely comfortable. When I first started, it was very much a case of fake it till you make it in terms of how comfortable I felt with it. And don't be afraid of that. You know, the best fundraisers and the most experienced fundraisers still have asks that feel awkward from the inside. So, you know, the first thing I would say is that you're not alone in feeling awkward. Everyone feels awkward about asking for money, partly because it's an awkward thing to ask for, and partly because we're British, and partly because, you know, kind of like Zoe said, you know, this idea of, I think, cultural institutions and cultural organizations and people who work in museums don't tend to be hugely comfortable with asking for money and selling themselves and this sort of thing. I think if you know, with certain other sectors like scientific research and things like that, where fundraising and asking for funds is very much built into it, it's less of a leap. So that's the first thing, is it's always awkward. Don't be afraid of it. Don't feel like you're on your own. But the second thing I would say is that it won't be unexpected from the person or from the trust or from the corporation. If you are a fundraiser or if you have fundraising as part of your role and this person has agreed to meet you, they know why they're at the table. They know why they're meeting you. They know why you want to meet them. So if they've agreed to meet you and you've got to this point where it's appropriate to make the ask, they know it's coming. You know, this is not going to come out of the blue for them at all. And when I realized that, when I got told that by another fundraiser, I found that immensely comforting. You know, everybody knows why they're at the table. Everybody does. You know, they know you're there to ask them for money, and you know that they're there to be asked for money as well, you know, and that is what it comes down to. So I would say that is a really key point, is that everyone knows why they're there. And also that they will have been asked before, more than likely, I would say. If somebody is a major donor or a high net worth individual, however you refer to it, the likelihood is that they will have given before. The likelihood is that they will have been asked for money before. So you won't be the first person to ask them for money. You won't be the last person. They will have negotiated this before, even if you haven't. And the worst thing that can happen is they say no. That is the worst thing that can happen. And that's not bad. That's fine. You know, and I have an attitude where when I go to a major donor and I ask them for money, and I have in my head the worst they can say is no. And that's not even a no, not ever. That's a not right now for me. That's how I treat it, is that, you know, this isn't the right moment or it's not the right project. It's not a no, get out, never talk to me again, you know. So that's the three things really for me that I try and have in mind when I'm going to make the ask, is that I expect it to be a bit awkward. I know that everyone knows why they're there, and that yeah, it's not going to be their first rodeo.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Zoe.
Just to I mean, I have nothing to add other than just one thought that I think I also find helpful, is that, you know, think a bit longer term. Think about, what if they say yes? That you're going to create this relationship with this person, and you probably already have created a relationship with them. So actually, that moment of awkwardness, you're going to forget that, you know, a year down the line when they've given you the big gift. And if they do say no, never darken my doorway again, then you don't have to deal with them ever again. And that's also quite comforting.
Yeah, I can imagine it might be in some cases. I wondered, particularly this year, around the things that have happened with COVID, of course, and also something that I think Christina might have mentioned earlier around the difference between fundraising for projects and fundraising for core costs. And I imagine this year maybe might have been a heavier focus on core costs for lots of places. I wondered if you wanted to say anything either about the COVID impact or what it's like to fundraise for something core rather than a shiny project. Georgia.
Yeah, I think this is kind of, I don't know how Christina and Zoe feel, but it's always the big kind of difficulty with fundraising is that it's in many ways a lot easier to raise money for projects, but it's more kind of needed and more useful to raise what we'd call unrestricted funds, which can just go into the central core budget and be distributed as needed. So it is a balancing act, and you know, in general terms, the truth is, for major donors particularly, it's hard to raise money for core costs because, you know, you can't really tell somebody where their money's gone. You know, that's one of the reasons that raising money for projects is a bit easier, is because you can ask somebody to support a project that you know resonates with them and that they will really closely believe in, or, you know, that means a lot to them. And then you can tell them exactly how it's gone, and you can tell them what you've done with their money, and they can really see the output and the value and the impact of what their funding and what their support has made possible. And the difficulty with asking for unrestricted funds, even though, you know, I think every museum could make a very strong case as to why it's so important to raise core costs, especially this year, especially with the sort of impact we're seeing across the sector in terms of just losses to budgets, losses to kind of income. What you're essentially asking people to do is give you money and trust that you'll do the right thing with it. And that takes a lot of trust from a donor, and from any donor, whether it's major donor, corporate, or trust. So you're asking quite a lot when you ask for unrestricted funds, which can be quite tricky to negotiate. And you do get some amazing donors who will just say yes to that, or will just say, you know what, we've been involved for a long time. You know, I know that you are a trustworthy organization. You know, I trust that you will do the right thing. And I know that this is the most important way that I can give, even if I can't see the outputs. And you get some amazing donors who will do that. But I have to say they're fairly few and far between. I've not come across a huge number of them, unfortunately. So yeah, it's this odd situation where certainly when I work on a project, I try and make funds semi-restricted if I can, where they go to the sort of area rather than to a very specific project, so that at least the team that's working on the project can redistribute if they need to. So it's a bit of a tricky one, I have to say.
Thank you, Christina.
I think traditionally, over the last 20 years or longer, museums have been moving into this more commercial model where your reliance is on catering, your venue hire, your retail, because of that kind of obsession with fundraising being so project specific, for all the reasons that George has just said. And what's been most mad, in my opinion, about COVID is how that model of how a modern museum is supposed to act and having, you know, a great cafe and what have you, has been absolutely flipped on its head, because now that visitor spend that everyone was becoming so reliant upon has now disappeared. On the one hand, that's been really good for fundraising because it has forced these major bodies, so like Zoe was saying, big trusts, so the big family trusts, statutory bodies like the Lottery and Arts Council, it's forced them to kind of address this issue of there being no reliable core funding for lots of organisations. So the Garden Museum is totally independent. We don't get any state funding, no local authority, no regular arts council, nothing. And so we've had to rely on these big applications for core funds, and hopefully that model will continue in some form into the future, because this model of fundraising, where you're just bouncing from project to project without having the resources to fund your infrastructure, your maintenance, your staff salaries, everything underneath your projects, it's not sustainable in the way that we're being told museums should become sustainable. Yeah, I think COVID has been obviously absolutely horrendous. It's been the most unbelievable 9 months for fundraisers. We'll have war stories after this for sure. But if it does bring about that change, which I do feel like it is starting to do, you know, something good will have come out of it.
Thank you so much, Zoe.
Just to, yeah, I completely agree. And I think it has been very difficult for income streams other than major donors to an extent, and corporate fund sponsorship to pivot towards more unrestricted funding. But I think what we have seen this year is those trusts, those statutory bodies being more relaxed and giving us the freedom to shift money about between budget lines, or to pay for more staff time as opposed to an object. That's a really bad example, but I think we have seen more of that flexibility and understanding. And I mean, it's a shame that it's taken a pandemic to get there. And I hope and can only really see this continuing as the years go by. I mean, on a more personal note, the Science Museum does have government funding that has remained, it has remained in one form or another this year. So it's been useful to kind of have that as a backup. But we have, as Christina was saying, it's been quite a few months for fundraisers. So we have still been kind of seeking funding. And I think we have seen that people are being more flexible, and that, you know, are more willing to see, are maybe still focused on projects, but more willing to see more costs within a budget for that. So more staff time, more maintenance, cleaners, security, you know, the costs that go into running a museum. So I think there is a bit of a shift going, and hopefully more.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Sorry, just to come in quickly, in that actually one of the things we've seen come out of COVID and the lockdown and the horrible impact it's had on the museum sector is the response from funders, actually, and a lot of, you know, especially I would say trusts and foundations, saying, you know, you may not be able to carry on with the project, but we will give you the money anyway, and you can use it for what needs to be funded right now, whether that is core costs, staff costs, you know, making sure everyone's got a laptop, all of these sort of things. And I think that is something that has been really kind of heartwarming as a fundraiser to see during this time, is that actually funders themselves have stepped up as well. And I think, you know, I completely agree with Christina that actually this pivot that we're starting to see, and I think we need to, as fundraisers, do all we can to keep that momentum going with it. This pivot that we're starting to see towards unrestricted fundraising be more of a norm is something really positive that I hope we can take forward from this year, because I think that will be huge in terms of ongoing impact for the sector in general.
Thank you very much, very much. Incredibly, we've got 8 minutes left. I don't really know how that happened because it's gone very quickly this morning. There's a really good question again from Marley here saying, I think following on from what you were saying a little bit earlier, Georgia, asking, are there areas within organisations that you feel don't get targeted funding, and how would you change this?
I think it's a tricky one, because there's certain areas that are easier to fundraise for. And those are things like outreach and education and kind of improving public access, these sort of areas that are quite shiny and quite easy to package up. So I don't know that I could name specific areas that are harder to raise funds for. I think, you know, there are definitely areas that fall under a certain category of less easy to raise money for. And those would be areas where they're less visible, where, you know, there's specifically for corporates and things like that, where they might be slightly less willing to fund something where there's less public eye on it, or there's less kind of real impact in terms of their values for it. So I think it's a tricky one, like I say, because there's areas that are definitely easier to raise money for, and then it's a constant battle to not let other areas really slip under the radar all the time. And I would say that those areas vary from place to place. In every organization, there will be certain areas that just struggle to get funding because they don't work on the big flashy projects and they don't work on the, you know, the exhibitions. And this could be things like some areas of the collection that just don't get used as much, or some area of the collection that don't perhaps feature in big exhibitions, or aren't as kind of eye-catching, and they're no less important and they're no less deserving of funding, but they're slightly harder to raise money for. And that can be things like, you know, at the Natural History Museum, there's a whole department down in the basement that's responsible for making stands and making the actual platforms that things sit on. And it's hard to raise money for that because people look at the objects, not the things that actually support them and keep them safe. So it's that sort of thing where it's a lot of the back end of things, unless you find a donor and you find a trust, or you find an organization that really sees the value of that and you can help them come to that area. I think that those can be quite difficult to raise money for.
Thank you, Zoe.
I think, yeah, completely agree, that because Science Museum also has people down in the basement building plinths and stands for things. And incredibly important, you know, we couldn't put on exhibitions without it. I think looking at it from an internal perspective with a larger organization, I often say to people, if they ask me about my job, that I'm professionally nosy, because what I want to know what's going on. I want to know what everyone's doing and how it all feeds into a project. And I think there are, like we were saying, you know, we're seeing more flexibility around project fundraising and putting things into a budget that we wouldn't normally expect a funder to want to support or to pay for. And we can do that with things like mount making, with regular cleaning, so the Science Museum opened the medicine galleries last year, unfortunately for a very short amount of time. But as part of that project, we managed to get redeveloped toilets as part of that gallery. Incredibly needed, might I add. And it's being able to it's knowing what needs funding that normally gets overlooked, and being able to put that into a project budget, I think is really key. But you have to just get out there and kind of prod people, you know, what do you need? What would you do? What could you do with some more funding? Tell me, and I'll see what I can do.
Thank you very much. I'm now kind of picturing the genie from Aladdin doing that "what do you need? What do you need?" thing. Anyway, we've got 2 minutes left, so I thought if you could just in maybe 30 seconds each tell everybody here something that you're really proud of that you've done in your roles at any point, something that you love thinking about or you'd like to bask in sometimes, just to help keep you going when there's lots of no's, or anything you'd like. I bet you've got loads of things. So, Georgia.
Yeah, sure. I'll start off. I mean, you know, when you work in major donor funding, you do work on, you know, big proposals and big asks for money, you know, and that sort of thing. But I have to say, I think the ones that I'm really proud of, and the ones that I keep coming back to when I need my little kind of win memory to sort of keep me going, are really the small amounts where it's been the difference between something happening and not happening. And those are the things that really mean a lot to me, is that, you know, working on a project, whether it's a schools outreach program or if it's an acquisition for a collection. And it could be a matter of raising, you know, £2,000 for for this project, for this acquisition. And it really is the difference between it happening or not happening. And it can be as little as that, you know, I mean, it's not a small amount, it's a large amount of money, but in terms of major donor fundraising, that's right down the bottom of the scale of what we raise. And it really is those sorts of amounts that can make the difference, especially for smaller projects where it really is, it's not necessarily all within budget. It's something that the curator or the collection care manager really wants to do and is really important, but it's not a priority. So it's not received core budget funding. And then being able to come in as a fundraiser and help make that happen and help support that work. Those are the ones that really mean a lot to me, where you get to work with the person on the project and you get to kind of feel as excited as they are that this is suddenly happening, and you know, it doesn't have to be kind of put off until next year and you'll try again. Those are the ones that really mean a lot to me.
Thank you. Christina.
I think the most proud I've felt has been in the last 8-9 months. It feels like all the work I've been doing at the Garden Museum for the last 4 years has been leading to this point. It's like all the relationships that I've built and all the, you know, all the friends who I've like learnt their names at the events and said hello, and it's all come home. You know, they all kind of thrust their arms out and helped us in our time of need, which has been incredibly moving actually, and yeah, just really satisfying to know that relationship building does work. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Zoe.
I'll be really quick. I think, yeah, Christina and Georgia completely agree with your examples as well. I think maybe one of the proudest moments for me was the Science City gallery opening last year at the museum, because that was something I'd seen from start to finish, including a no from the Heritage Lottery Fund that later turned into a yes. So I think, yeah, that whole resilience piece, having a no, coming through it, getting that yes, and then seeing the gallery come to life was pretty special.
Thank you so much, everybody. What a lovely note to end on. I'm glad that we did. We're just 1 minute over, so we definitely have to call an end to today. But thank you so much, Christina, Georgia, and Zoe, for being here. It's been really fun to listen to you, and I've learned a huge amount as well. So we will end the session in a few minutes. I will just let you watch the thank yous coming in because they're deserved. And then Tom will end the session semi-abruptly. So we will hopefully meet again. Thank you so much for being part of the summit. It's been great. Take care.
Thanks for having us.
You're so welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.